I'm Garrett Brown. I invented the Steadicam, which is a camera stabilizing gadget that was quite revolutionary in the 70s.
My name's John Baxter. I wrote Stanley Kubrick, a biography.
I haven't seen The Shining for 20 years. The last time I saw it was soon after we did the work.
To me, these images are among the most evocative and powerful in all of Kubrick's work. From the very beginning, they tell you what kind of story this is going to be. It's a story of a single, weak human being moving into a world where he's simply not going to be able to handle what faces him. The image of Mount Hood there in the background in the Pacific Northwest is particularly commanding. I think one of the great choices that Kubrick made for this film.
It's not knowing what's around the next corner. It's pushing into his kind of reality. And it makes the maximum use of film's 3D qualities that happen when a camera moves, which of course is my business, moving the camera.
Kubrick hated to fly. For the last 30 years of his life, he wouldn't set foot in an aircraft. These were all done, the helicopter shots and all of these early scenes were done by the second unit cameraman Doug Milsom. But they're nonetheless characteristic of Kubrick, as is the rolling titles. This brightly coloured, moving lettering is something that seems to have stuck with Kubrick from the very earliest days of his films. Most of his films have these rolling titles, and he would agonise over the colour, often changing the colour of the titles 4 and 5 times until he had exactly the right tone. Kubrick looked at scores of locations before he chose Oregon's Timberline Lodge for the Overlook Hotel in the movie. The exteriors are all done of the Timberline. The interiors are copied from the Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite. The interiors were rebuilt in England so that he could have complete control over the whole look and tone and sense of the film. The lodge becomes a character in its own right, isolated on this slope, a slightly sinister look about the exterior, which is carried forward into the interior. This, of course, shot in England, entirely recreated on the set in the way that Kubrick wanted.
The moment I saw these sets prior to production, I knew that I personally wanted to be a part of this. And this was my first day's work on The Shining.
And it introduces us to the character of Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson. Nicholson is an actor that Kubrick has always been interested in. He actually cast him as Napoleon in the version of Napoleon, which he never got to make when Nicholson was quite a young actor, and he always wanted to work with him. And to put him into this was a brilliant piece of casting, because the concept of the film fits precisely into the character of Nicholson, especially the character of Nicholson as he was at this time. He'd just come off making his first film as a director, Going South. He'd come out of a number of difficult personal problems, and he was a man with issues which could all be used to advantage in the film.
This scene took 4 days, and I believe it was originally scheduled for 1 or 1.5. We got that entrance of Jack's pretty much in 1 day, which was a bit misleading because almost nothing else in the movie was done in a single day.
This is an introduction of Jack's family waiting for news of whether he got the job. Shelley Duvall playing the wife, and young Danny Lloyd, 6 years old, but playing the son, who becomes the central figure in the film as the story progresses, because it is he who has the psychic ability which is called the Shining.
How do you do?
Back to the big interview and discussion with the hotel manager, Barry Nelson, where certain elements of the story are introduced. It comes out that the hotel was supposedly built on an ancient Indian burial ground. This is a very popular theme with Stephen King, turns up in a number of his stories. The idea that somehow in building the building or somehow creating something on the site, that everything about the building, everything about the people in it is to some extent cursed. This interested Kubrick a lot, and he picked it up and ran with it probably more than the book justified. Nicholson seems very smooth and urbane and convincing, but as we will learn later on, he's a man with many personal difficulties. He has a history of alcoholism. He also, supposedly by accident, but perhaps intentionally, injured young Danny in a drunken rage some time earlier, which establishes him as a risk to the family. And once they're isolated in the hotel, the risks expand and finally become life-threatening. Barry Nelson explains or mentions that something similar happened with a previous caretaker, a man named Grady, was occupying the hotel for a winter and murdered his wife and children. And again, this is something that lurks in the background to be picked up later in the story. It's very striking in this scene, as in a number of other scenes in the film, this symmetrical framing that Kubrick loved. He was meticulous about the screen picture. He insisted that every image be framed in the proportions of 1.66 to 1, which gave it something between widescreen and cinemascope. He wanted things placed centrally. He wanted the people to fill the frame. He wanted to make us stare.
Motion picture cameras' viewfinders have an object called the crosshairs, which is on the so-called ground glass inside where the optical image passes through to your eye. And the crosshairs are right in the middle of the frame, subject of many, many arguments between Stanley and myself as to where those damn crosshairs should be placed on a scene. If on an actor's left nostril was what he wanted, no other nostril would do. And of course, I'd say, well, Stanley, you're not going to print the crosshairs. The audience isn't going to see the damn crosshairs. But bit by bit, over those 40 takes, I learned, first of all, that I could do it with the heavy camera that was in use, a brand new object called the BL, a silent 35 camera, quite massive. And secondly, I learned that there'd be 40 takes of everything, nearly. And that one paces oneself. And the first 5 are when you learn to do it, and the 14th is when it gets great. And every take after that is nearly perfect. I also learned to hold the camera absolutely still at the end of these takes, because half the time Stanley used my essentially handheld camera to continue the scene as if it was a tripod. And if you stopped with a foot in an awkward spot or with your balance slightly off, you were stuck. That was it. Your discs flew like frisbees and your sweat popped out on your forehead, and you just stayed there until Stanley said very quietly, cut. In the beginning of this scene, for example, most of the dialogue and the two-shot that begins the scene was the tail end of my walking shot. 3 minutes each time.
Every scene brings us back to the central theme of The Shining, as far as Kubrick was concerned, which is that of the family. As he said later on, it's the story of a family going insane together. Jack is already unhinged, is already on the verge of insanity, and gradually his wife and child are drawn into it. Danny, of course, having a psychic ability, is able to pick up on this quicker than anybody, and therefore becomes the focus and the victim of the story. To some extent, it reflects Kubrick's own difficulties with his father, who was the greatest influence in his life. He was a doctor in the Bronx, taught Stanley everything he knew, taught him about music, taught him about literature, taught him chess, and therefore exercised not a sinister influence, but a powerful one. So in these images of young Danny talking to his imaginary companion who lives in his mouth and communicates through his forefinger, we get some sense of what was going on behind Kubrick's manner. This is just such an extraordinary image. This is one of the great horrific images, I think, in the cinema. I've never failed to be astonished by the virtuosity of this. Again, the way in which we're dragged into the horror in an instant, and the lift doors gushing blood. It's an extraordinary Freudian image, really remarkable.
Now hold your eyes still so I can see.
One of my first convoluted shooting jobs was carrying Shelley and the doctor down this corridor and into the living room and setting them down using the vertical booming ability of the Steadicam, just as if it was the jib arm on a crane or a dolly. And that took place within the first week that I was there. We were in this set for 4 days, and I did that shot 30 or 40 times, and then realized that the essence of it had almost nothing to do with me, because my takes were roughly identical. It had to do with Stanley watching and waiting and letting the performance play up or play down. And I actually have to report that I liked that a lot. I liked participating in that way of working, because I got a chance to refine what I did to an extent that I'd never even approached before, like a dancer rehearsing or being on stage every night for a year. I got to learn the closest dimensions of the apartment and what would happen if this foot was 6 inches in this direction, or if I took another half step. It was actually not that physically demanding either, because between each of these takes, there would be a 3-minute playback. We recorded video on all of them. And then often it's not a 3-minute argument about the nature of the shot or where the dreaded crosshairs were and so on, which I realized Stanley sort of used as a way to stall and have another opportunity to do it so that he could attend to his main business, which was really what the actors were doing.
Okay.
And here again, of course, I held the tail end of this shot for 2 or 3 minutes, so I began to learn what it takes to cruise up into a position like that and hold it that long. And I got eventually to look around and, almost like an acolyte, look at the thing as if I was trying to imagine what Stanley was looking for. Shelley's face, for example, is in its way as fascinating as Jack's. I mean, superficially, we wondered, why wasn't a beautiful woman cast for this role? Why wasn't the sort of logical wife to Jack Nicholson cast? But by the end of the film, I think it was understood why he cast Shelley. Something so odd and unusual and vulnerable and almost in a way abusable by circumstance about her that when I see it now, it sort of makes sense to me. In the end, I think it was great casting. They're not heroic. They're not movie star types. They're flawed and unpredictable and in some ways dangerous in that way. They're not TV people at all. And Danny is a phenomenon, an absolute phenomenon. Looking at the film again after all those years, I'm once more struck by how astonishing his face was and his acting and his control of himself.
We can always think about having some tests done.
Danny Lloyd was chosen from through a search of some thousands of children. He actually was a 6-year-old boy, never had any dramatic experience, was the son of a railroad family in Midwestern United States.
One of the reasons he was cast, I understood, from his trainer, handler, friend, Leon Vitale, who was responsible for teaching Danny his craft. One of the astonishing things that Danny did in the casting session was this tony voice and the idea to hold his finger up and move his finger and talk to his finger, which evidently was Danny's idea and which came out in the casting session, by my understanding. So the combination of these three is quite fantastic, riveting at its best. And Danny held his own with Jack in particular in an astonishing way. and with Stanley in an odd way, and with Leon and everybody else. Danny has evidently chosen to live his life in relative obscurity and not be an actor and so on, and bless him for that. But I'm almost sorry not to have seen more of him. As sorry as I am in some ways not to be able to see more of Stanley's films at this point. I was terribly sorry that he died so, in effect, prematurely, and I think before he had really finished Eyes Wide Shut. These shots, incidentally, were done in the Going to the Sun Highway at Glacier National Park, and I'm pleased to say it was my notion. I shot for Stanley's second unit in Colorado. Colorado is a wonderful place, but the roads going up the Rockies don't have this level of detail or vertiginous plunges and so on. And the dailies that were coming back from the helicopter shots were dull. And I finally said, having just been there, I said, why don't you look at the Going to the Sun Highway, an astonishing piece of road in Glacier National Park. And that's where Stanley dispatched Greg McGillivray and his partner to make these astonishing flying shots, which are so Kubrick to me, so centered compositions, penetrating space. And Greg McGillivray did it with amazing simplicity. He simply bolted a Arriflex camera to the front skid of the helicopter. And then his great trick, he balanced the blades of the helicopter so there would be no vibration. He had the blades balanced, which apparently is a maintenance operation for helicopters. And he and his very gifted pilot simply flew the framing of those shots. So it's smooth as glass. It's an ultra wide-angle lens. It's great.
At this point, the story begins to diverge from the original Stephen King image. King's novel is a novel about a hotel which is haunted. It's that simple. He never meant it to be anything more than that. But for Kubrick, it was the story of the family gradually going over the edge and the hotel exacerbating that, making it worse and finally driving them to the brink. It's the point at which the two stories diverge, and they continue to diverge wider and wider until at the very end, The Shining, as originally written by Stephen King, has really very little to do with Kubrick's version of it, which is very much psychoanalytical and Freudian. And in this, Diane Johnson was crucial. Diane Johnson and Kubrick worked on the story. She said what she found emerging was a sense of family hate and also a sense of the father and son conflict, which dominate the film. As Jack is introduced to the hotel and his family is shown around, we begin to get a sense of the hotel, the building almost as being an entity of itself. The design motifs recall the Indian burial ground on which it's supposedly sited, and that sense again of sort of ancient evil, things to be expiated. The sheer size of the hotel was one of the biggest problems for Kubrick, because he insisted on it being built more or less to scale, or the interior rooms being built to scale. Getting around was an enormous problem.
The tours of the hotel give you the first idea of the vastness of these spaces. In between shots, one of my jobs was to go off and find ways to ride on vehicles so that I wouldn't have to walk and run all of these traveling shots. And we tried every vehicle you can think of that was available in the studio, every kind of cart, and finally settled on a bizarre wheelchair that Stanley had invented with a man named Ron Ford, which I could sit on and therefore not have to tire myself out walking for everything.
And it created a sort of fluid, hypnotic kind of style, which eventually suffuses the whole of the film.
Stanley didn't respect this idea at first, but actually it made a lot of sense because the Steadicam takes out the bumps of the floor, and I'm free to concentrate on framing and so on.
So as we watch Danny playing, we see again the images of the two Grady twins who were murdered by their father, a crime that is to be replicated by Jack. So the hotel is really beginning to emerge as a character in the story, and with it all of its demons.
Most of this was shot in continuity. We shot these scenes in the order that they'll be seen in the movie. I think part of that was because Stanley wanted the opportunity to change things, rewrite, alter, plug in an inspiration. It's a curious mix because His nature is to control every aspect of the shooting, from the air conditioning to the logistics of lunch to the distances to the various trailers to the choreography of the various players going stage to stage. And yet, for himself, in the end, he wants to preserve every possible bit of spontaneity. And he's not above grabbing a hold of my camera and pushing it to get the framing that he wants, which is a first. No one had ever done that before. The irritating thing to me is that it worked and the framings were good. Stanley's daughter Vivian shot the making of documentary while all this was going on, and at one point I let myself be overheard saying that when Stallone had grabbed the camera, that reflexively I had tried to punch him. And Stanley never grabbed the camera again, but I think he knew it was a gag. Here's the exterior in Boreham Wood, and that hill, pushed in there by bulldozer and planted with ever smaller pine trees to force the perspective, concealed a suburban neighborhood right over the top of the hill.
But contrasted with this is the pastels and the domestic tranquility of the interiors, as against this exterior where the building looms above the people, dwarfing them again. Shortly we'll be introduced to a crucial element, the fact that in the winter it becomes snowbound and it's impossible to get around except in a snowcat.
This ballroom set is so vast that it's inconceivable that it would fit within even the giant exterior of the hotel in Oregon or Mount Hood, wherever it is. Before we came to work on this set, which must have been several weeks in, every day there was a lighting test made here. And these practical lights were run up and down in various combinations by the late, dearly departed John Alcott, who was the director of photography, and tested on film. And one of the things that we did every day was, during the lunchtime dailies, was look at the film tests of the lighting. So even lighting took place over numerous iterations where it was lit and then looked at and adjusted and tested and lit and looked at.
This is to bring us to Halloran, the Guardian, played by Scatman Crothers, who is another of the crucial figures in the story. He too has the psychic ability of young Danny. He has the shining, and he can communicate with young Danny.
Here's one of my favorite shots in the film, backing up with the Steadicam in this vast kitchen set, where it quickly became clear that for it to look good, wide angle like this, I almost had to make racing corners and cut all the corners with the camera. And of course not hook myself on mixing machines and racks of pots and pans and so on. That's a wonderful way to see a space.
As Shelley Duvall and Danny are led through the storerooms and the kitchens of the hotel, Halloran and she discuss it in terms of a maze. And a maze is what, of course, becomes the central image of the film later on. This, again, sets up so many images that will turn up later in the story. For such an important character as Halloran, the casting was fairly straightforward. Scatman Crothers, who was a minor character actor and had been a band leader and singer in his youth, was a friend of Jack Nicholson, and he persuaded Jack Nicholson to suggest him to Kubrick for the role of Halloran. You know, like in the Bugs Bunny cartoon. I think it appealed to Kubrick that Halloran might be seen credible as a person who shared the psychic ability of Danny. It proved to be a terrible experience for Crothers, who wasn't a technical actor, and Kubrick, who by this time was famous for putting his actors through terrible experiences and multiple takes, drove him endlessly, making him retake simple scenes 10, 20, 30 times, finally driving Crothers to say, "What do you want, Stanley? What do you want?"
Even a shot like this was done a surprising number of times, during which I, since this was a zoom and a conventional camera on a tripod, I sat it out in the background somewhere, working on getting the camera down at the eye level of Danny. We had made an arrangement for that before I left from the States, and it actually involved an upside-down version of the Steadicam with the camera on the bottom and all the rest of it up top, so that the lens in so-called low mode could be down at a Danny eye level, at waist level, between waist and knee. And there's some fascinating things about the cinematography. For example, Stanley loves wide-angled lenses. They make the sets look large, and they augment that sense of motion. But I learned quickly that these wide-angle lenses need to be on a camera that's level fore and aft, level front to rear, because if you tilt up or tilt down even slightly, those lenses do something called keystoning, which makes the set look distorted and somewhat bizarre. So for you would-be filmers and videographers out there, if you're using ultra-wide lenses, keep the camera a bit low and keep it level fore and aft. And it keeps the sets looking much, much better and much more impressive.
This is a particularly significant scene where Halloran and Danny bond for the first time, and Halloran explains that he too has the psychic ability which his grandmother named Shining, that gives him the ability to, if not communicate directly with him, at least understand something about the experience that he's going through.
We call it Shining.
Scatman and Danny's relationship in this movie is a key and interesting one. This scene between Scatman and Danny Lloyd has acquired almost legendary status. It may be the most number of takes in history for a single close-up, this one. Stanley did 148 takes of a 7-minute scene on this close-up, and a great many takes on Danny's close-up.
I'm not supposed to.
Somebody once said of Kubrick that he was not like a film director, really. He was more like a medieval artisan working in an ivory tower, sort of sculpting and grinding and polishing away until he had the perfect result and the perfect image. And once again, one sees with Kubrick this wonderful sense of beautiful framing. You have a real feeling for the characters and for the exchange because he works so close and so symmetrically.
You notice Scatman's eye line is to camera right here. Danny's now to camera left. That's how reverses are done. That means that the two-shot would have to be over here on the side that we're on now, this side, a wider over. So if Stanley shoots the opposite angle, which I'm not even sure is in this sequence, he also had to shoot all the eye lines for the other angle. None of us could understand what he was after 148 times with Scatman. And Scatman was astonishing. He gave and gave every take. He was there for Stanley. It was a version of what Jack and everyone else did there. They simply turned themselves over to Stanley and let themselves be employed, you might say. He wanted to see the permutations, the variations. He wanted to see every possibility. He wanted to let the actors play it out, get their sea legs, as it were, and I think he just wanted to see it. He wanted to see how it fell out. Finally, Scatman couldn't take it anymore. Stanley felt, I guess, cruel in some way and put an end to it. And then when Stanley walked away, Scatman said to me, "Oh, that's Stanley. He's really something." And I had the impression that he had almost deliberately wept a bit just to stop the torment.
The significance of room 237 in the hotel appears. As we'll see later in the story, room 237 and the things that go on there represent the heart of the horror of what is going on in the hotel.
Everything that one sees in The Shining, which is part of why I'm so impressed seeing it again now, was real and done in real time. There was only one slight reality-changing effect, which I'll describe later, but the rest of it was actually done right there, then, in the camera, boom. No digital stuff, no CGI, no painted-in things, no green screens, etc. And that's an experience that's hard to even find these days because it's so easy to digitize. I think if the movie was made now, they would have inserted scenery outside these windows. As it was, those are just, diminishing sizes of pine trees against the vast white 700,000 watts of light.
There was always an element of play about Kubrick. He agreed with Orson Welles, I think, that making a film was access to the greatest train set any child ever had. And he loved doing these scenes.
None of us knew quite how impressive this was until we sat in the dailies and heard this astonishing sound. I had the microphone on the Steadicam. The wheelchair, of course, had rubber wheels and didn't make a noise, and the mic was on the front of the wheelchair and very directionally aimed forward at Danny's very noisy plastic wheel, so of course that worked wonderfully well. But even Stanley was astonished by the sound and by the effect that it had on that shot. That lens, by the way, was nearly 2 or 3 inches above the level of the floor, which is one reason it looked so cool.
You have this sense of a flow of images and of people's minds moving around, somehow rattling around almost in this huge building. So these little scenes of domesticity are curiously anachronistic. Somehow it no longer seems relevant to have a normal home life in such a place. But Jack seems to be responding to it. In these scenes, he's almost his old self, but as he grimaces in the mirror, as he begins to look a little more manic, we can see Kubrick favouring slightly wilder, slightly more exaggerated facial movements. He would have done this scene 50 or 60 times, and the shots that he chose to use would very often be the last ones where Nicholson and Duvall are almost mugging, they're telegraphing their feelings a lot. And you have a sense that somehow the hotel is exercising its effect.
I'm sure you can imagine that when a scene like this is done in an interior set, particularly if it's done in the same set day after day, the set remains dressed, it remains lit so that one basically turns the lights on and adjusts the dimmers and you're ready to go. You acquire such a familiarity with a set that the crew troops in as if they were working in a sitcom and operating in this, or a soap opera, and operating in the same sets day after day. And the call sheet contains, for a matter of form, the list of things that have to be there. This call sheet would have described the bacon and the eggs and the flowers on the trolley of her breakfast trolley, and the particulars of wardrobe would all be specified in the call sheet.
Like a signal, we see the typewriter, which will become a vehicle again of the next stage of his madness as he begins work on the novel that he's supposed to be writing. But of course isn't writing it. He distracts himself with games.
This is one of our earliest close looks at this gigantic Colorado lounge set. And this one had 1,000,000 watts of light outside those great rows of windows to the right. Jack did that scene 40 times, throwing that tennis ball 6 or 8 times.
Look out!
We're introduced for the first time to the maze that again will become more important as we go on. There was no maze. In fact, the maze was created on an airfield near London. The branches are stapled onto slabs of plywood and the interiors are empty. Of course, Kubrick would have been aware of the Freudian significance of the maze and probably even of Alfred Hitchcock's remark that the convolutions of the human brain resemble those of a maze also. And we increasingly see the hotel as a reflection of Jack's disturbed state of mind.
And these scenes were great fun, again, sort of racing turns, cutting the corners. I still love the way this looks. The ultra-wideness of the lens makes the maze look enormous. The only special effect that we did in the entire film that might be in the same league as some of the effects done so casually today was Stanley found an apartment high up on a nearby apartment block, and he built just that center section of maze down at the base of the apartment and dressed it in with that colored gravel and made a zooming shot down into that bit of maze with doubles for Shelley and Danny. And that center of the maze is actually matted into an identical zoom on the maze model, which was quite a good model. And that's it, folks. That's it for special effects. The rest of it actually happened in some form or another. I find myself less and less interested in those special effect shots because they almost always overdone. It's so easy for them to be overdone. And more interested in scenes like this where it's actually happening.
This huge stage would later be used, in fact, for the Well of Souls in Raiders of the Lost Ark and for numerous other massive films. In building it or having it built, Kubrick had an influence on the pattern of English cinema for the next 10 years. To write the screenplay of The Shining, Kubrick did find a writer who didn't have any credentials as a screenplay writer, but seemed to share some of his preoccupations. Diane Johnson was a novelist and academic from California.
And you can bet Stanley wrote the dialogue for the TV commentators about the woman disappearing on the mountain, but it all contributes to the effect that snow and isolation are on the way here. And this little environment is about to be sealed. And we start to get into the hotel almost as an entity. Danny's like a microscopic little mobile guy, you know, in the veins and arteries of this hotel. I still like watching what he does with this. One consequence of the shooting schedule, which, although scheduled for 100 days, went on to 250 or something like that, is that Danny noticeably got older during it. Grew up, retired. No, but nearly. Leon, his trainer, handler, friend, worked very, very effectively with Danny. He was extremely enthused about the work. He loved his days. He enjoyed being on the picture. He liked the way Leon taught him how to do it, and he was an amazingly quick study to give back the timings and things that look like the work of a grown-up actor. It's tough to get kids to not move quickly or to do things in their kid metabolism, which is much, much faster than an adult metabolism. And Leon managed to get Danny slowed down to the point where it's just riveting watching him.
Danny understands the significance of room 237. In the book, it's room 217, but there really was a room 217 at the Timberline Hotel, and the owners asked that they change the number. So Kubrick chose the number 237, which is a number that he'd also used in Dr. Strangelove. It is the code number that has to be punched into the computer in the B-52 in order to trigger the atomic holocaust that ends the film. These beautiful, smooth tracks, just part of the hypnotic sense of the shooting of the film. And that sense of moving into Jack's mind and into the maze that's inside begins to become clear. In this scene, as Nicholson writes what is supposed to be his great novel, but will turn out to be both less and more than that, you can start to see Kubrick's technique working. He would have taken all of these scenes scores of times, 60 and 80 times in some cases. And Gordon Stainforth, the editor, has explained the effect that this had on the actors. He said that Nicholson, for his first 5 or 6 takes, would do it in a fairly conventional way. Then he'd run out of ideas, so he'd sort of relax. He'd spell himself a bit and do 5 or 6 takes where he was really very neutral. And then Kubrick would say, OK, do something different. And Nicholson would begin, well, to mug, in effect. He would begin to do exaggerated movements of the eyebrows, wild looks in the eyes, very vigorous physical gestures. His voice would rise to a pitch of hysteria. And it's those takes very often that Kubrick chose to use.
I was here while this was shot, and I saw that Jack did takes that were rather friendly, and takes that were more and more harsh, and takes that were more and more manic, and the final edit was selected by Stanley.
The irony of this technique is that Shelley Duvall, who didn't have much to do but just sort of sit back and react, found it extremely tiring to be working over and over, take after take, with this manic performance. It's the mania that makes us believe in the second half of the story and the violence that ensues. All through this part of the story, the hotel is beginning to become more and more isolated. The snow is building up. Gradually, all ways of communicating are cut off. To me, this image is one of the 2 or 3 key shots in the film, almost as vivid in its way as the image of the doors gushing blood. Because the way Kubrick tracks in shows Jack Nicholson in his essence, a man at the end of his tether, a man with physical and emotional problems, a man who was facing enormous difficulties on screen.
The second unit, which photographed the hotel in Washington, went back to do winter scenes there as well. And of course it cuts perfectly with the construction of the Overlook in England. This was the tail end of a long walking shot, so my eye goes to the frame edges. If I see the tiniest bit of motion, it reminds me this was the tail end of one of my shots, impersonating a tripod. I began my career shooting in the feature business, 3 movies at once nearly in 1975. Bound for Glory was the first one, which was the Woody Guthrie story. I did a kind of revolutionary walking shot through the crowd. And then Rocky, which was used the Steadicam because the director had seen this demo. One of the shots in it was my then girlfriend, now wife, Ellen, running down the Art Museum steps. So I ended up on Rocky doing things that had never been done before, chasing Stallone around and following him through the meat market and in the ring, of course, during the fight scenes. And I think I had perhaps done 8 other movies between those 3 and the beginning of The Shining, and tended to do special shots brought in to do this or that sequence. What didn't occur to people until Stanley got the idea that this was a tool that you could use every day on a film. So this was the first time that I was there for the entire schedule from beginning to end, and available as Stanley's tool or weapon for penetrating space, for moving, for following things, without the hassles of laying rails and worrying about the quality of the ground. You notice these compositions are typically very centered in this film. This was something Kubrick liked, particularly in this period, sort of Palladian-centered compositions where the so-called appearing point where we're headed is right in the middle of the frame.
For the moment, we're only aware of a growing sense of foreboding as the hotel is cut off from the outside world, connected only by this thin wire of the radio telephone, which very quickly will disappear also.
Even if you go around a corner, you go from one centered composition to another. It's part of that eerie, 3-dimensional, penetrating space that works so well. Diabolical to operate, of course, because everywhere in your shot are verticals that need to stay that way.
Kubrick very cleverly introduces more and more graphic elements into the story as Jack's mania increases. For the first time in this scene, we see the actual murder of the 2 Grady twins, hatcheted to death by their father. And of course, it terrifies young Danny, who immediately takes refuge in his hidden companion, in his forefinger.
I actually I think I learned my trade on The Shining, really. I was good with the thing when I showed up, and I think without the slightest immodesty, I can say I became a master at it by the end of this schedule, through the miracle of repetition. I also learned a hell of a lot about filmmaking in general, because every aspect of it interested Stanley, from the physics of lenses to the steadiness of his projectors that he owned, which were rebuilt every 3 or 4 weeks so they'd be absolutely steady, to the exact sharpness of the lenses that he used. He resurrected some ancient tests called HARP tests to test exactly whether the calibrations on his lenses were as written, engraved on the sides. The result, of course, was that anybody there who paid the slightest attention got to participate in this dialogue and learned a hell of a lot. I think this is summer of '42, the movie on the screen. I'm not sure the significance of that. Must have been another Warner Brothers picture. The snow outside, by the way, what's falling is styrofoam. And what's piled up in the foreground outside is salt. Dairy salt, dendritic dairy salt, so-called, which is a diabolical substance to work in. Salt rots your boots if you walk in it. Salt corrodes the equipment. I think salt had something to do with why people didn't like working in salt mines. They were hot and they were full of salt, not unlike many of the scenes in The Shining. We had 900 tons of salt. Of course, that's an interior you're looking at through those windows. That's all of 10 or 12 feet out to the lighting. I knew this apartment as well as I know my own house. In some cases, it was just easier to use me standing there than to bring in tripods and dollies and so on.
This is Nicholson at his most vulnerable, his most sensitive. He's not mugging here. The fact that his hair is disordered, the fact that the picture is framed in this way, in this domestic interior, it just gives you a glimpse of perhaps the Jack Torrance that might have been. The Jack Torrance that existed before he became enmeshed in this continuing nightmare of the hotel.
This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and it was done a fantastic number of times in order to get this real time, real effect to actually happen. Phenomenal. That tennis ball was actually sent in by somebody, and it took about 50 tries to get. But it's, and by the time it was done, we were all bored with the idea, but on screen, it's tremendously effective.
Indications of what a great filmmaker Kubrick really is come with these scenes here, where we begin to see the evil of the hotel becoming manifest even to Shelley Duvall and to Danny. This ball just comes rolling into the shot, and we're not sure where it comes from. We're not sure whether even to believe it as objective reality or as a fantasy, in the same way as we don't know whether to accept that there really is something evil in room 237, or that Danny is somehow creating a fantasy to justify and explain what's happening to him in perfectly mundane ways.
I think the editorial pace of most modern movie making, even most movie making contemporary with The Shining, was much faster than this. And there's something that I really like about scenes being given their amount of time.
Jack Torrance is subject to nightmares in which he imagines the family being murdered, as will almost happen at the very end of the story.
I had spent a lot of my career early on with the Steadicam running here and there, because the original conception was it was a stunt camera. It allowed you to run on rough ground and up steps and so on. I almost did no running whatsoever in the entire production of The Shining, except this one shot. When I invented the thing, this is what I thought I'd end up doing. This is what I thought it was good for, was running shots. It wasn't clear that it was precise enough to do the slow-moving, imitating dolly stuff. That one actually worked out pretty well. This is a scene, oddly enough, that we did almost like anyone else would make a movie. We did it once or twice, and that was it. Everyone was in shock. We did it, we moved on. Not sure why. I think Stanley just had a sense that he had it. He didn't want to do it again. I don't know why. At one point, early on in the negotiations to do this picture, I was told by Stanley's brother-in-law, Jan Harlan, that I was to be paid a rather low number. Since I wanted to do the movie, I agreed. And Jan very blithely said, of course, we'll never go more than 6 months. And fortunately, I had the wit to say at the time, well, if you do go longer than 6 months, then it's going to be my normal U.S. rate, which was a good deal more. And I said, at 6 months, I have to shoot Rocky II, as I'd been booked for that. So I had to arrange that I would train another operator to take over for me at that point. And then I said, and if you have me back after that, I need to fly back and forth on the Concorde, week on, week off. Week in England, week in the States, because by then I have some other things I have to shoot. And Jan said, that's okay, don't worry, Garrett, we're not going over 6 months. Well, this is the 6-month point you're looking at now. This is the work of Ray Andrew, an operator that I trained, who took over to do Steadicam shots on the dolly and on the wheelchair, while I was gone for a month to work on Rocky II. And when I came back, we were on the Concorde back and forth deal.
As this scene ends with Danny emerging from room 237 with the marks of strangulation on his throat, we're thrown once again into total confusion. Kubrick had always had, some would have said, an overdeveloped sense of protection towards his children. One of the reasons why he'd moved from the United States to live in Britain was that he felt they were under risk from an atomic war. And he remains in all his films curiously sensitive to the vulnerability of children. It makes this particular scene very significant because the fact that Danny has been apparently attacked, perhaps by the malevolent creatures in room 237, but perhaps by Jack, who after all has a history of having injured Danny in the past, gives a special charge to it. And Kubrick emphasizes this with this final shot of a zoned out, almost crazed, disbelieving Jack, barely able to encompass the thought that he may have injured the child he loves.
How
With the attack on Danny, Kubrick ratchets up the horror one notch. Before, the possible reality of the evil within the hotel was represented by something as banal as a rubber ball rolled into shot. And we never did see what was in room 237, which may or may not have attacked him. But now the demons begin to become much more real. We can see it in Jack's behaviour, which is increasingly eccentric and physical. And also in the reappearance of his old nemesis, alcohol. It was him being drunk which had led to the attack on Danny earlier on in the story. And now we see his entry into the great bar of the hotel as a trigger for not just a simple manifestation, a brief manifestation of the demons, but the real thing in the person of a real barman with real alcohol.
Stanley wanted control over every aspect. At one point he got the idea that there should be a speedometer on the wheelchair that I was riding on so that we could move the wheelchair exactly at 6.2 miles an hour for every time we did the take or whatever it was. And I began to be afraid that Stanley would hang an outboard wheel on me for even a walking shot, like those test cars that are on the track with an outboard speedometer wheel. So we were very much hoping that that idea would go away, and fortunately it did. This is a scene that I like a lot, and the reveal is quite good.
And in a wonderful coup de théâtre, the barman is played by one of Kubrick's favourite actors, with whom he had worked repeatedly on films from The Killing onwards, Joe Turkel, who always to him represented a figure of solidity, reliability, good nature and amiability, perfect as a barman. In a way, one could say that the barman character is almost like Hal, the computer in 2001, the voice of reason who supplies everything the man needs but never really becomes human himself and increasingly becomes an image of the sinister and the malevolent. And with the first drink in some time, Jack begins to plummet into the abyss of violence. With this performance, Nicholson really turned a corner in his acting career. Up until his performances, the sort of degenerate drifter and drunk in Going South, he'd been fairly conventional performer in films like The King of Marvin Gardens and Five Easy Pieces. You begin to see him behaving in a much more unhinged and crazed manner with Going South. And under Kubrick, it's almost as if he has a postgraduate course in going over the top. He began to describe his performances in slightly different terms. He called his performance in this sort of balletic, as if the physical was more important than the gestures. His biographer said that he descended into lunacy. He became crazier and crazier with each role. And one can see in this, particularly in this scene, the Jack Nicholson of the last 10 or 15 years, the mad Joker in Batman. It's a grotesque, it's a clown, it's a madman. It's all in this performance.
You would think that we would have shot Jack walking in and then Shelley walking in immediately. But we shot in continuity. We shot Jack walking in, then his whole dialogue scene, then we reset for Shelley. We didn't get to see these clips until we actually saw the movie. They're quite fun. Reminds me of the news culture of the 70s, which is very different than today. This, of course, is Scatman's apartment in Florida. And Stanley selected the set dressing for the apartment for reasons that are obscure. This set was built on one of the smaller stages. And of course, it was anticipated that we would be here some 15, 14, 13 weeks after shooting began. We're actually arriving to shoot it now months and months after that, but the set has been dressed and ready and essentially lit, and the lighting has been tested and observed in the dailies months before. I haven't worked for Clint Eastwood. Friends of mine have worked for him, but his way of working is well known, and that is Clint doesn't use video assist to watch what's being shot. He simply watches the action as it takes place. He typically does 1 or 2 or 3 takes at the most, and production moves on. A tremendously different way to work, and of course, Clint never would nor could shoot The Shining, and Stanley never would have or could have, I think, shot the movies that Clint did. Probably he wouldn't be interested in them and vice versa. But what I learned over the years was that the way of working is almost indistinguishable from the result. It's a part and parcel of it. The way Stanley works is the only way that a movie like this could be made. Here's another point of view, Jack's point of view. Notice the difference in quality between a point of view, which is an entity's look-see, you might say, and a normal traveling shot, which is your omniscient third, God's eye view, audience's eye view, that is not meant to feel like something is lurking, which for me is a good reason that handheld isn't a great way to shoot, the general run of moving shot, because the shaky camera looks like somebody's doing it, somebody's looking, somebody's there. Curiously enough, shooting a nude scene for a camera operator is a generally completely non-erotic phenomenon. My mental monologue would have been extremely boring during this. It's all to do with framing, and of course I'm watching the scene on a small green video monitor, so which takes a great deal of the heat out of the phenomenon. And it's all about framing and, well, not all about framing. I mean, even on a small green screen, it's a novelty, it's fun. After 6 months on the same sets, it's diverting.
The fantasies that Jack encounters in room 237, in particular the image of the beautiful nude girl who turns into the rotting corpse of the older woman, very much out of Kubrick's own fantasies. They're not in the original story, and they do reflect his disquiet and discomfort with physical sex. He never really had a believable sex scene in any of his films, and it was never his strong suit.
Well, the most interesting thing about it, of course, is when that very clever cut reveals that it's an rotting old hag in his arms. It was somewhat bizarre for the crew because the rotting old hag was, as known in the call sheet, Mrs. Gibson. And Mrs. Gibson started to work on the 10th of November, and I think was in makeup every day for 8 days. The call sheet actually specified a dressing gown and a carpet slippers for Gibson, which I thought was pretty amusing. And Mrs. Gibson was very unselfconscious. She would stand around and have the makeup touched up. The mind boggles. I'm tempted to look up Gibson and find out what her story is. We all had a certain amount of stir craziness of cabin fever. Increasingly, as we got down closer and closer to the kind of madness that overtakes Jack's character, kind of sympathetic madness overtook all of us. But the pace of the work never increased. That's something that amazed me about Stanley, was that he never relaxed that intent. First of all, to make it all perfect, and secondly, to have it play according to his own interior clock somehow.
This is very conventionally cut between the fantasy of the hotel and the reality of Halloran, who has made the psychic connection with young Danny and is now realizing that he must go to the hotel to rescue him. And characteristic of that element in Kubrick's character that loved the commercial movie. He was a curious filmmaker in that he wanted at the same time to make films that were intellectually respectable, but also would appeal to large audiences and were cut in conventional ways. You see it in these confrontations and family scenes. They're banal in many respects, very conventionally cut and ordered, but they're designed to draw the audience into the story, to prepare them in a way for the next slice of fantasy.
I enjoyed watching John Alcott at work because Stanley and John worked out a way for me to look almost 360 degrees around a set like this. And the way it was done was by very clever dimmer cues for these practical lights, so that the lights I was facing were always dimmed up to be the brightest lights, and the lights behind me were dimmed down as I spun around and looked in different directions, mainly so that the shadows that they would have caused were diminished and washed out by the practical lights that were in the foreground as I turned round and round. Quite a wonderful choreography and quite invisible to the viewer. And John would hold up a square flag and flag off any light that was likely to create a shadow. And we got quite good at this, particularly in sets like this where we worked over and over and over. Of course, nothing that we did, no matter how well we did it, sped up the work. It was a tour of duty that just had its own timing, and it just went on and on.
What happened? There is no other explanation.
In this scene in particular, where Jack, in a way, tells her his side of the story, his fantasy, it's very difficult to believe in any part of it because his performance is so mannered at this point. Obviously a very late take when he was really working exclusively on his nerves, and it makes the scene both incredible but also curiously disturbing, as if the fantasy is penetrating to every corner of this domestic reality. Nicholson is looking particularly tired in these scenes. He insisted on living well away from the set in Chelsea and had to be brought in every morning. Most of his sleep he would get in the car driving out to the studio.
And of course, the more wasted he looked on film, the more logical it would be for Jack simply to go back to London after the work and stay up all night and get no sleep and become a completely dissipated guy. At least that was how we imagined it, because he showed up always asleep and looking exactly the way he'd looked when he left, generally arriving within 30 seconds of his call time. But for all we knew, he'd been asleep on the car seat all night. And from this time on, he gets more and more wasted and crazed and distracted.
In the documentary that Vivian Kubrick made about the production of the film, you can see that he is really beginning to suffer from the distractions of his life off the set. The strain is also probably attributable in part to the fact that by this time the shooting period had quadrupled. It started at 17 weeks and had now gone to 3 times that, and they still weren't finished. Kubrick was in one way happy about this because it meant that when he did the exterior scenes, which had originally been planned for summer, he no longer had to fake them because it was well into winter. Meanwhile, the managers of the studio already booked other films to come in. Warren Beatty's Russian Revolution story, Reds, and Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark were waiting for the space, but they'd have to wait quite a bit longer. John Alcott's photography and Roy Walker's design begin to show to advantage as the images become more fantastic. By filling this corridor with smoke, it gives an unreal, dreamlike effect, but also prepares us for this extraordinary shot.
Here's a case, for example, of a dolly shot that takes Jack across the ballroom with the entire crowd working. This is the one big crowd scene in the movie. Not only filled with people, but filled with people from another era. It's a party of the 1920s. We accept it so readily because we've already accepted the idea of Turkel as the barman. So Kubrick has very cunningly led us into a presence inside Torrance's head. So we begin to share his reality, and increasingly his family seem completely marginalized. Stanley grumbled when I would rotate back to the States on the weeks off and weeks on. I think they rationalized it in the end that it was a productive thing. They could do the dolly shots while I was away and concentrate on the Steadicam when I was around. Stanley joked that the Steadicam would probably get credit for all the dolly shots in the movie anyway, which I certainly hope is true. I was sorry to miss this scene, though. This was said to have been a lot of fun. They dressed 200 people.
Your money's no good here.
The party, in fact, turns up more and more as the story goes on until the final enigmatic image of the film is about this party.
Orders.
We're invited to think that, in a way, it's a party that is always going on, that it always has gone on, that the reality of this, of the hotel is a kind of loop in which Torrance and all the rest of them are caught.
Notice the haze in this room. That's oil smoke. The special effects smoke in that era was made by vaporizing drops of oil. That's not allowed on sets anymore.
Anything you say, Lloyd. Anything you say.
But it does create a wonderful atmosphere, and of course it became hugely important for all the exterior and winter stuff. And this is the party lighting for this ballroom scene, which was much tested before I left for the States. The great thing about lighting on dimmers like this is you can run it up, run it down, try it, shoot it every which way, and then sit there and absolutely pick the way you want it to look. This one is the perfectionist's way. Even that barroom lighting was much experimented with, and it's very effective, that bottom light for Jack and for Joe. Stanley's daughter, Vivian, shot the documentary on the making of, very capably shot it with a handheld camera. She was 17 at the time and was everywhere on the set, a ghost, and quite trusted by the actors and so on, so she got some wonderful stuff. She's in this scene someplace, I'm told, but I've never been able to spot her. They dressed her as a 20s flapper. She's in here somewhere.
Like most directors, Kubrick enjoyed working with actors he'd worked with before. They were a kind of stock company. And now another one appears in the person of Philip Stone, the English actor who also appears in Clockwork Orange. There's something about familiarity that works with directors like Kubrick. They don't like to have to feel they need to coach each actor in exactly their way of working. Stone was phlegmatic in the best tradition of English actors, like people like Murray Melvin, who also appeared in various Kubrick movies. He was a person who was unflappable. In this scene, the Torrance gradually realizes that the waiter is in fact Grady, the previous guardian of the hotel and the father of and murderer of the two children who appear in frequent fantasies. And Stone's way of introducing himself, of gradually admitting to the truth, is very effectively done, culminating in this line really worthy of Boris Karloff in some ways. I have always been here. And we realize that Jack also has always been in the hotel. This scene's particularly striking for the design, probably the most garish urinal in the history of cinema. It relates somewhat to the Korolva milk bar in A Clockwork Orange with its pop art manifestations. This was something that Kubrick was finding increasingly fascinating, partly under the influence of his wife Christiane, who was a painter herself.
This is a great example of what happens to you on a big movie, a movie that takes a while. There are always times when the agenda of the director and the agenda of the chiefs, you might say, becomes not only incomprehensible but almost uninteresting to the crew. We're the workers. We are responsible to get it to happen. But once the scene commences in one of these sets, how long we're there is out of our control. Not only how long we work in that set, but how long the scene takes. And this is a scene that Stanley must particularly have wanted to slow down the movie and accomplish at this pace.
This scene is actually much more compelling and revealing than it might at first seem, because the very stilted dialogue, which could almost be out of a rather second-rate film of the 1930s, in fact addresses the themes of The Shining, the idea of childhood and children being rebellious and needing to be, as Stone says, corrected, and when their mother intervenes on the side of the children, that the mother also needs to be corrected, which in his case, and as the red walls reflect, ended with their murder and dismemberment. And on the other hand, in the background is the old 1920s ballad Home, which evokes exactly the values for which these two men are supposed to be standing up, but which in this context has a really sinister note, which is emphasised by the red and also by the stilted positions of the two actors. They're not even trying to communicate physically. It's all done in the eyes.
Philip Stone's eyeline doesn't even look like he's looking at Jack in this scene. He looks like he's looking off to the wall to his right. It's curious. It's very curious.
The overall effect is something like a 1930s horror movie, but also something like a kind of nightmare dream which you know is going to end in violence. And it's beautifully staged, all the more so for being completely still. Probably the hardest thing for Kubrick to do was to persuade his actors not to do anything, merely to convey something with their body language.
Poor Shelley spent however long it was, 100 days maybe, in hysterics. The fortitude of the actors during these scenes was amazing to me. Relatively easy for us. We show up, we do our mechanical tricks. But when the emotional is your palette, your stock and trade, and you're at the high end, the hot end of the spectrum, day after day, that's a phenomenon.
Red drum!
Even Danny had to be at an amazingly controlled pitch. His little Tony voice getting deeper and deeper and more interesting. Danny Lloyd, at that time, weighed exactly the same amount as my camera weighed. And so if I took the camera off and made a sling on the so-called mechanical arm that flew everything and floated it, I could float Danny Lloyd as if there was no gravity and run along with him lofting up and down beside me and laughing hysterically. Jack actually had a lot of respect for Danny and was very interested by him. Everyone did. Even Stanley, who said some really wonderful things about Danny. And in the background, during all of this work, is the very idiosyncratic English way of making movies, which at the time was very orderly, but somewhat chaotic, if you can accept that combination, in that the personalities were, they spoke in Cockney slang, rhyming slang half the time. They were insouciant and disrespectful and joking half the time. And yet, the proceedings were very civilized. There was a great deal of formal courtesy between certain departments. The tea and bacon roll trolley came around regularly in the morning and the afternoon, and you had a break to contemplate a cup of tea and an utterly vile, grease-covered so-called bacon roll, which, for my taste, is bacon with a large gristly bit in the middle. And then, as of the evening, when the day had gone on about 10 or 12 hours, we were released. And I went back to the village of Boreham Wood and stayed in my little odd hotel room at the top of an old kind of mansion that had been turned into a hotel and looked out over the English greenbelt. It was a very, very, very different time, not only for movie making, but of course for the way we lived. I was in a considerable degree of isolation from my family in the U.S. Transatlantic phone calls were a rarity. No computers, no email, nothing. The company did not go on location very gracefully, although all of Barry Lyndon had been on location. They were somewhat out of the habit by the time of The Shining, so it was like rounding up a collection of ducks to get us all to somewhere to do one of these shots. The only other location that I can recall was a airplane shot that was done in a grounded airplane, British Airways plane. And here again was a case of big flat light outside the plane. It could have been anywhere. I'm always struck by how beautiful the light is in this set, from nothing more than those huge outdoor soft lights and the practicals on dimly, and a bit of a fire in the fireplace, if you noticed. Tell you more about that in a bit. This was a stock shot, I think, and of course they only landed the plane once, which is a unique moment in the photography of The Shining. One take only. I was struck by how realistic the snow effects were by the time they were timed, this deep blue. Again, all the smoke to create that atmosphere was oil smoke released upwind from the set and wafted into the set by guys with big boards, wafters. And very cleverly, of course, they spot the wind direction and release the smoke just upwind. This telephone box was imported from the U.S. and planted, I think, at a local airport. That was another location jaunt. This is Tony Burton, the actor on the other end of the line with Scatman, who turned out to be a very good chess player. And I would often find Stanley and Tony Burton duking it out with a chessboard. And Stanley was a little annoyed at being beaten once by Tony, which was amazing because Stanley was, I think as a kid, was a master, if not a grandmaster chess player. But Tony was a very bright guy and I think managed to beat him once, and that was a celebrated event on the set. This was shot just up the road and was salted in, and then in my memory, real snow appeared. And all of these sets were infested with smoke, vast, vast quantities of smoke.
Right now.
The dailies looked very much as you see them here. In other words, we didn't see them in a rudimentary form. We saw the scene as it would appear in the movies, because one of the things Stanley controlled were what are called the printing lights in the lab. He actually specified the amount of the various colors of light that would be put through the film when it was printed. So those exterior snow scenes, those wintry scenes, would normally have looked almost brown or orange because of the quality of the real light, but with the blue printing lights printed through, or the lights that yielded blue in the print, that produced the winter effect, and that's what we looked at in dailies. Stanley loved film, the chemistry of it, the physics, even the mechanics. He liked watching the Steadicam at work. Never tried it on, though. Tried to get him to try it on once, but he wouldn't do it. Danny's growing up right before our eyes here. I think it's a good thing this did not take 2 years or 3 years to shoot, because that could have required digital special effects. It would be interesting to see that scene cut directly with the first scene in the movie where Danny appears.
In another ominous tracking shot, Shelley enters the lounge and discovers the secret of Jack's supposed work on his classic novel, on which he's been typing endlessly throughout the story. Kubrick loved gadgets, especially electrical gadgets, and was delighted to have an electrical typewriter and used to use it constantly, demonstrating its possibilities. And the chance to create a completely fantastic text for Jack's novel was just overwhelming. So he had the text made up entirely of the phrase repeated over and over again, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." Having done this, decided that there should be, in fact, a real manuscript of 500 or so pages so that it would be absolutely authentic. And so a secretary was employed to type out the same phrase over and over again, sometimes as text, sometimes as dialogue, sometimes as description, so that no matter where Shelley dipped into the pile of paper, she would find a credible page.
Stanley's secretary, Margaret Adams, spent months typing every moment that Margaret wasn't doing something else. Margaret was spitting out dozens and dozens of sheets a day. And of course, they were formatted differently for each sheet. One of the best conceptions in the book, though, I think, and in the film. And all the typos and all the weirdnesses of typewriters really made it work. Of course, in this era, with computers and printers, this scene would have, A, made no sense, and B, had no point. She wrecked them every time Shelley pulled them up, so new ones were needed. This is a wonderful scene. To me, one of the most effective in the film.
The next scene caused one of the major difficulties in the film, because it involves Shelley attacking Nicholson with the baseball bat that she's carrying around. Kubrick agreed with Nicholson that there should be a stuntman for the role, but of course couldn't just choose a single stuntman. He summoned every available stuntman in London to come to the set, and then each of them had to be given a jacket equivalent to the jacket that Jack wore. And then each person had to be screen tested for Nicholson. In the end, the supervisor, the head of the stunt unit, was the man who eventually doubled Nicholson in the fall down the stairs after he's attacked by Shelley.
Let's talk.
These scenes took place while I was shooting Rocky II. So this entire sequence when Shelley was backed up the steps by Jack, swinging her bat, was shot by Ray Andrew, my understudy, you might say, for Steadicam. I wasn't present for the blood pouring out of the elevator scene either. That was done quite late in the schedule, not in sequence. Apparently, that was a one-taker or maybe a two-taker. I think they cleaned it all up and did it twice and then decided it was too much work, but it worked miraculously well. That blood, by the way, is called Kensington gore. It's the actual motion picture blood that they sell in small quantities for wounds. And Stanley insisted on having 2,000 or 3,000 gallons of Kensington gore, which is very expensive stuff, but it behaves like blood. With a schedule this long, I suppose its clotting time would become a factor. They were greatly unhappy that I was leaving, somewhat suspicious of poor Ray, although I have to say, looking at the stuff that he did a fine job. The English crew was tough. They were rough. I mean, they would give people nicknames and make fun of them in some ways. They called poor Ray Unsteady Ray, which is not true. He did a great job. But it was just their way. I have to say, I think this stuff is indistinguishable from what I might have done with it, and very difficult. I'm also sure that these scenes were shot over and over and over. Now, where in the spectrum of apathy to hysteria is this performance from Jack? Did he actually do some that were quiet, or were we all at this level of intensity? And look at Shelley. This is a form of torture. I observed Stanley being quite cruel to her at times. I think coldly, just pragmatically, to get her into a certain state for the shot. And she put up with it. She endured it. And she delivered for him. You've got to hand it to her for that.
My responsibilities to my employers.
I do like the scene, though. I like the continual backing up.
Until May the 1st.
It's one of the fewer shots that plays continuously in a longer lens, a little longer lens. That might have been a 50 mil on Jack, and this is probably a 35 on Shelley.
There's an interesting parallel between what happens now to Jack and what happens with Hal at the end of 2001. In both cases, the evil person is incapacitated and then sort of deteriorates into another mode, tries to appear more amiable, becomes more innocent, appeals to the person who is attacking them, tries to use all its guile to stop its destruction. So in 2001, Hal says, you can't do this, I feel my mind is going, and then becomes a sort of infant singing Bicycle Built for Two. But now Jack, locked up by his wife, also reverts to an earlier stage of reality, becoming like the loving husband, like the pathetic figure that he was, even to trying to tell her what she most wants to hear, that he's ill and needs treatment, that he loves her, that he is the Jack that she knew before, but fortunately she doesn't succumb.
Incidentally, Stanley himself is lying on the ground underneath Jack with his handheld Arriflex.
be just like nothing ever happened.
I brought a wireless little video transmitter made in the States because I really didn't want any cables attached to me so Stanley could watch what I was shooting, running around here and there, and particularly in the maze. Film cameras produce video so that the directors and so on can see what's being shot as a byproduct, in effect. And Steadicam operators use that video up on our little green screen so that we can see what we're shooting, because you can't operate Steadicam with your eye on the viewfinder. So, unfortunately, the transmitter that I brought was terrible, and I never heard the end of it. The signal would disappear, and it was worse than useless, so I ended up lugging a cable around. And I found a man in London who had built a better video transmitter that was hooked up to the mains, as they call it, plugged in, and persuaded him to make a 12-volt version, and that actually worked. So all of these scenes, Steadicam scenes, were done sending the video off by wireless, just as if we were a little TV station to Stanley and the watching crowd at the monitor, which became tremendously important when we finally got into the maze. But at one point, Stanley must have had a horrible thought that the neighbors in Boreham Wood, these ranks and ranks of houses just over that little hill, all of whom had big Yagi antennas aimed at London for their TVs, he became afraid that they might be sitting there watching what we were shooting in the morning. And I made the mistake of imitating a Monty Python woman in the crowd of women going, "Ooh, poor Mr. Brad. Stanley's being very cruel to him today." Or, "Ooh, it must be the 24 Distagon lens. It's vignetting around the edges." The women got more sophisticated as the shooting went on. And he overheard me and then was afraid that his stuff was being seen by them. So I assured Stanley that the studio walls would never let the signal out because they had a wire mesh in the wall. And then I took a portable monitor outside and walked around, and to my horror, quite often here and there would be a perfect signal from inside the studio by some weird chance of RF propagation or whatever you might say. And Stanley, believed he knew something about every form of human activity and had large arguments with me about antennas for receiving the signal and mine for sending it and so on, many of which he turned out to be right, which was even more disturbing. But what I did was I learned where the signal didn't come out, so I offered to show Stanley, and we walked around and with this little battery monitor, and I took him to all the places where the signal didn't get out, so he was quite satisfied that nobody anywhere could have seen what we were doing. And so I was permitted to continue using this wonderful device, which is still a mainstay of Steadicam operating, because it's terrible to be hooked to a cable when you have got all the freedom that we've got normally.
In a sense, you can see the nervousness of the film being reflected in the speed with which these titles appear. At the beginning of the film, the titles are 1 month later, 3 months earlier. Now they're times, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock. You have this sense of the pace quickening. In the same way, we now find ourselves completely in Torrance's madness. For the first time, we see the evil of the hotel manifested in some manipulation of physical objects when he's actually let out of his prison by Grady.
Jack, by now, has 2 physical infirmities that he has to include in his acting regimen from here to the end of the movie. One is the sprained ankle, and the other is the famous cut on his head, which is described in the endless numbers of call sheets as Jack's blood makeup. And Jack was put in Jack's blood makeup every day from the 15th of November to the 12th of January, which is as long as the entire schedule for most movies. And of course, every other aspect, hair, wardrobe, the same boots, the same socks, the same shirt, find their way back on him every day, all day. The stubble has to be the same length. All this stuff, of course, if you've paid attention to the way movies are made. But, it all seems in starker relief when you consider it in the context of a movie that goes on like this.
I have my doubts.
This was the amazing power that Stanley had. He could just simply keep going. Empire Strikes Back was standing by to come into those stages in Boreham Wood, and they waited for months for Stanley to finish. And we had most of the place tied up, so they waited. They just waited. Finally, in fact, the Colorado Lounge set, which was on stage 3, burned down.
Just a few close-ups remained to be shot. This had happened also on 2001, where the giant centrifuge set had burst into flames. Now the whole set of the hotel burned down. This was a disaster, of course. As long as it was burned down, they could simply tear down the rest of the set, build the new set for their other clients, particularly Warren Beatty's film Reds and Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and start from scratch. But they didn't take into account Kubrick's obsessive respect for contracts. He said that under the agreement he had with them, they had to provide the set, even if all he had to shoot on it were a few close-ups. It was only at the very last minute that Spielberg could move in with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And in fact, while he was shooting, Kubrick was still editing The Shining at the same time as the Spielberg film was being shot.
This was done, by the way, in Washington State, I think. And then this shot of Scatman was Stanley's front projection once more. Front projection was how Kubrick did the African monolith scene that began 2001. It's a very clever trick. Rear projection is there's a screen back there, and they project a movie on it from the other side of the screen, and it always looks somewhat projected. Front projection involves a half-silvered mirror angled in front of the lens. The projection is shot down against that mirror and bounces out to the 3M material screen at the other side of wherever, windows in a car, etc., with perfect accuracy because it comes from the center of the film camera's lens. And then it bounces back and is perceived at any level of exposure at really high resolution. The reason I mention it, of course, is because I'm still impressed, even more impressed than I was, over the quality of the matching between the real snow stuff shot in Washington or Oregon and the fake snow, salt, and styrofoam that we ended up making in Bourne Wood. Now, to Jack's repertoire of physical infirmities, we add a prop that he must carry for the rest of the movie, the axe. I like this, the way this swinging the axe scene is operated. The regular operator, Kelvin Pike, did it on a so-called geared head. 2 turns back, 2 forward, 2 back, 2 forward. And of course, there were 6 or 8 doors standing by, and each door chopped through quite differently. Here's Danny sliding down salt. It's very effective, isn't it? Doesn't it look like snow? It's great. I was, of course, in the bathroom, being the only camera rig that could fit in there. The room was the size it looks, tiny. Now, I was standing right by the door as that axe blade came through, splinters flying like on the deck of a 18th century man of war, wearing no helmet, no eyeglasses, no OSHA-required full body armor. It's a much more casual age to do with things like safety. I can tell you that required a lot of fortitude on my part not to flinch when that blade kept coming through there. This is Stanley's hand with the actual knife, a trick knife with blood in it. There's a second unit shot in real snow showing the hotel, the real hotel on Mount Hood. Those snow scenes that will come to dominate the last sequences in this film involved a vast amount of human labor and a lot of environmentally difficult things going on.
Nicholson is a staring actor. He has these piercing eyes. And as the story goes on, the eyes become increasingly significant in Nicholson's performance. We begin to see the madness arrive through the eyes.
And here is the same snowcat, or similar, in the salt at Bourne Wood. Wonderful match.
If anybody had reason to regret his part in The Shining, it was Scatman Crothers. Not only was his role radically changed in the film version, in the movie he's axed by Torrance almost the moment he steps into the hotel after his heroic voyage across country to rescue them. In the book, he rescues the wife and child of Torrance and takes them away from the hotel. But on top of that, Kubrick demanded numerous takes on his fall after he's been attacked by Torrance. Crothers recalled later on, "Somebody said something about me being too old to fall down that many times." And Jack Nicholson jumps up and says, "Who says my man's too old to fall down? Why, he can fall down 50 or 60 times if he has to. I wound up having to go to a chiropractor. I was hurting so bad. My arms and elbows and neck and head got kinda beat up."
One of my favorite sequences in the movie is Jack's pursuit and destruction of Scatman. We were a bit shocked to find that Scatman was actually going to be killed. This is almost a classic Steadicam shot. The timing is very organic with Jack, something that would be hard to do with a dolly and a dolly pusher and an operator trying to communicate, not to mention going up the stairs. But it's wide angle. That has to be done at some distance or, forgive the expression, but Jack's ass would have looked enormous if you were following him too closely up the stairs. The timing of it had to almost time with his limp and stop dead and hold as a so-called over-the-shoulder. Here's another of my favorite shots. This is 3 flights carrying the BL, which weighed altogether about 60, 70 pounds. We did 35 takes. It occurred to me later that that's the equivalent of climbing the Empire State Building, lugging the Steadicam. It's, 100 and some stories. But it really wasn't all that difficult because it was do the shot, 3-minute playback, 3-minute argument about the crosshairs. Could have done it forever. And yes, folks, I don't know. Just another day on The Shining. That exterior maze, of course, wasn't out there. That was just the near wall of it. But a wonderful lighting effect when it was lit up. Jack actually threw the switches that turned it on. The exterior scenes, when it was actually snowing, and when the people making smoke were doing their thing, must have been an astonishing sight from Borehamwood Wood right over the hill. It would have been like War of the Worlds almost, the rising pall of smoke, which of course blew down over the town. The escaped bits of styrofoam snow tumbling down out of giant bins up on cranes, the cranes sticking up as high as, Martian creatures in War of the Worlds. All visible from town, and if there was a breeze, the styrofoam coated the town. The smoke pall dimmed the lights in Borehamwood Wood. It made me think while I was there that this is the equivalent of a steel town, of a Pittsburgh in the steel area, polluted by the local industry but unable to care or mind because the money, the income of the town is derived from it. And we were in the maze for a month.
And the crews used to move around within the mazes, but which became a problem after a while, especially when they were shooting in fog and snow, because even though they were all given maps, many of them actually got lost, not within the avenues of the maze, but inside the mazes, the actual objects of the hedges themselves.
We would go in the maze and almost immediately get lost. It was impossible to tell where you were. It was an intensely difficult set from the temperature and the fact that it was a fire hazard, terrible fire hazard.
The family was a maze. The idea of psychology is a maze. The intricacies of the human mind are a maze. And in the end, of course, it's in a maze that Jack reaches his apotheosis and dies. In the original story, there is out in the garden a number of what are called topiary animals, animals sculpted out of plants. And in the original novel, these come to life and rampage around. But Kubrick never liked that image very much and replaced it with that of a maze.
I got back from one of my little Concorde trips, and this work had just been done. I wasn't present for it. These skeletons were almost a disappointment. I mean, they were like conventional horror movie stuff. It was almost like a letdown that the purity of this Shining scheme had somehow been violated by somebody who wanted to see some real horror movie props and paraphernalia, complete with glue, cobwebs, and the whole business. This, by the way, was a great tour de force. I actually had some shoes made with little Danny-sized kind of little stilt-like things, so it made me even taller than I was. And I did a reverse angle of this, backing up in Danny's footprints while he was making that fake, misleading set of footprints that stop. I recall seeing the trailer for this film and seeing this shot. Of course, it was nearly a year after we'd finished working on it because it was in editing for quite a while. But I had not seen even the dailies on that blood shot, so that was amazing. That's real sweat on Jack. It was very hot. And those of us who gave it a thought were terrified of fire, because if it did catch fire, there would be no way to find your way out. If it caught fire and went dark, it would be even worse. But fortunately for all of us, it never did. This is another case of, now in so-called low mode, flying that ultra-wide lens. This was actually a handheld shot of mine. So here is that 9.8 millimeter lens, held dead level, penetrating space, pushing through space, revealing God knows what. I sometimes wonder about these commentary tracks, whether it's a mistake to raise the curtain on all of this. But I suppose you wouldn't be listening to it if you didn't want to know. There was no way to plan any of it. Jack went somewhere and I reacted. This is done in a mode called the Don Juan mode of Steadicam, where you run forward but you're shooting backwards. This is almost like a bit of dance, totally ad-libbed, not the same twice. Stanley off somewhere, watching it on video, wireless video, shouting in comments sometimes by walkie-talkie, acting like some sort of wrathful Nielsen family, watching, judging, controlling the content. Between my legs was a little fill light on a stick. Over my head was a sound man's boom. When we ran ahead of Jack, the three of us had to run and not fall over one another, our boots rotting in the salt. And yet, it looks cold. Very, very cold.
Kubrick, by nature, wasn't a maker of horror films. He'd turned down the chance to make The Exorcist and Exorcist 2, which he'd thought banal. But in this, he obviously felt there was more to be said, that the Stephen King story could be a vehicle for his own disturbed feelings about childhood, about family, about the relationship between fathers and sons. In the research, he read books by people like Bruno Bettelheim on what exactly it is that terrifies us, what are the sort of things that address the basic human fears. And he and Diane Johnson wove this into the story, making it much more of a psychological portrait and less of a horror movie.
And a mannequin of Jack that was amazingly lifelike, frozen in the end.
It was always Kubrick's idea to take a devalued genre and kind of scrape the barnacles off the bottom and relaunch it with his own particular style. He was very successful doing this. He did it particularly with 2001, with the science fiction film. He did it with the period film in Barry Lyndon. In each case, he was able to do what he most liked to do, which is to show off his incredible technical facility, his imagination, his unique vision.
It's very hard when you've worked on a film to see it as an audience might see it. And the audience for this film keeps changing it. It was, in effect, my generation back then. I was, 36 when I shot this film. I'm now 64, and it's become a favorite, a cult favorite. It's still a favorite of young people. It still ranks very high among people's favorite films.
Like every Kubrick film, its stature increases with each year. So increasingly, as with 2001 and Barry Lyndon and Full Metal Jacket, it seems now less to be a part of the genre than a genre all of its own.
I'm very sorry for no further opportunity to be with Stanley or work with Stanley. Most of all, I'm sorry not to have a chance to see another Kubrick film and another and another. I think that the movie business is much poorer for his death. He was unique.